Even a century later, the history and the lessons of this revolution still terrify those in power. It was a global earthquake that cracked the very foundations of the imperialist world and inspired a wave of anti-colonial and class liberation movements across the planet. It was a revolution that overthrew the wealthy ruling class in the biggest country on earth, marking what was then the greatest emancipation of workers and peasants in history. It shattered the war plans of an empire, broke the chains of foreign capital, erasing billions in debt, and proved that ordinary working people could seize power and hold it. In this video series, we'll explore the revolution that withstood and defeated not one, but two global counter-revolutionary attempts to crush it. It is a revolution that shaped the entire 20th century and still defines the politics of our own time. It is for this reason that its history is demonized and falsified. The powerful, from fascists to liberals, have spent decades rewriting it, turning hope into fear and freedom into oppression. The propaganda machinery is so powerful that many on the left have internalized its distortions. It is so pervasive that the counter-narrative has seeped into everyday thinking and language, all to defeat a history lesson that endangers the current order. This is a story on how to make revolution in times of climate catastrophe, of rapid concentration of wealth and rising poverty, where people look for answers to change the world. A world built on exploitation, war, and genocide. This is a story that answers the questions about the essence of a state, the concept of democracy, and the true meaning of freedom. This is the story of the revolution that marked the new beginning of the history of the human species. This is the story of the October Revolution. Over the past few years, I've studied this history from different angles, reading various books, exploring different perspectives, and speaking with experienced, organized people deeply familiar with the subject. To tell this story, I didn't just rely on secondary sources about the period. I also studied the tactics and ideas of the revolutionaries who lived and fought through it, learning the story from within, so to speak. Interweaving historical events with the theoretical and strategic conceptions that were central to communist movements long after the October Revolution. That perspective is too often ignored or dismissed in mainstream history. It takes me a lot of time and effort to produce these videos, so if you want to help keep this channel going, please consider supporting it on Patreon. Every contribution, big or small, matters. Thank you for being here. Now, in order to have a solid starting point for understanding the events leading up to the revolution, we have to travel back in time, just a few centuries before 1917. In the 16th century, Ivan IV slaughtered and conquered his path across the steppes, earning him the title, the Terrible. He centralized an autocracy, subjugating countless different nations, ruling a vast domain through terror and feudal exploitation, and was the first Russian monarch to be crowned Tsar of all Russia. Tsar coming from the Latin word Caesar, which in those times meant emperor. This title will remain for the ruler of the third largest empire in history, an empire which was to last for 200 years before being shattered by the Russian Revolution. In your average history video or school lesson, history is usually explained through the acts of a few powerful individuals, people who supposedly changed history through their own willpower, acumen, or clever manipulation. That's what's called the great man theory, and it's a big part of how liberal and popular history is told. But to really understand what happened, and to cut through the myths, we need to look at this history through the lens of historical materialism, one of Marxism's key concepts. Behind every leader, institution, or idea lies the force of whole groups of people who share specific material conditions and interests, the real engine of history. Who has to work for a living? Who owns the land, the tools, and the machines? History isn't simply driven by great ideas or moral progress, but by changes in how people work and produce what they need to live, and by the struggles that arise from it. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open, fight. To put it more simply, if you want to understand what's happening and how things are changing, look less at what individuals do and say, but instead at what millions of people have to do to survive, to pay their bills, and who profits from them. And whenever you do look at what people say, keep in check what class those ideas serve. The class perspective is thus of central importance not only for understanding this or any other revolution, but it has important consequences in actual revolutionary strategy, as we will see. In Russia, class society was organized around serfdom. Most of the people in Russia were peasants, who worked as serfs on lands which belonged to a noble landlord, in Russia called the boyars, who were the social base of the Russian state, and whose wealth came from feudal rent, which means from the exploitation and poverty of the peasants' labor. These peasants had to work several days a week on their master's land for free. As serfs, they were owned by the landlords, just like domesticated animals. They couldn't legally leave their village or marry without the landlord's permission, and could thus be sold out of their family, traded for dogs, horses, and furniture, or beaten and killed with no consequences. Even though the Russian autocracy based on landlord rule was more centralized than in the Western European feudalism, it was still the whole class of feudal landlords and noble houses that were the power basis for the top feudal lord, the Tsar. So, in terms of our historical materialist analysis, this means that the power, wealth, and ambitions of the Russian rulers was always directly tied to the poverty of the Russian empires, 99%. But how can you keep millions of people in a brutal state of oppression without them organizing a revolution? One key player in this class domination was the Orthodox Church, which was deeply tied to the Tsarist nobility. It owned vast estates and serfs of its own, sometimes entire villages that worked the land for the monasteries and bishops. Most peasants were illiterate, and the church controlled nearly all education and moral teaching. It taught that the Tsar ruled by divine will, and that this social order was God's plan. It told peasants that obedience, humility, and suffering were holy virtues, that to accept their poverty was to gain reward in heaven. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. In every class society, the dominant ideas, what people believe is normal, true, moral, or common sense, are shaped by the people who own and control society's wealth. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. What is true in modern class society was also true during feudal times. The powerful have to make their interests sound like everyone's. That's how power maintains itself over decades and centuries. Each new class which puts itself in the place of one ruling before it is compelled, merely in order to carry through its aim, to represent its interest as the common interest of all the members of society. This is just how God wants it, becomes this is just how the economy works today. In capitalist class society, the church's role has been largely replaced by media corporations, think tanks, major universities, and social media algorithms. And today's compliant bishops are various bootlickers of the rich, pseudo-intellectuals, historians, and various media personalities who shape what we think, not at all times consciously, but always by structure. Because if you control people's minds, you don't need to rely solely on police and prisons. But religion wasn't only an instrument of oppression, It also became a means to endure hardship and a language of resistance. The Duchabori, for example, a Christian ethno-religious group, refused military service, burned weapons in protest, and preached communal living. The Tsar's state persecuted them brutally because they rejected the Russian Orthodox priesthood. This institution of the Orthodox Church will be a central player in the fight against rising communism. However, the ruling class cannot always secure consent through ideology alone. When the mask slips, revolt becomes possible. As in any other feudal class society, the peasants of Russia would organize fierce rebellions, requiring massive violence to suppress them. Ivan the Terrible married Anastasia Romanovna, which made her family name famous. But when Ivan died, his only surviving son, Fyodor I, left no heir to the throne, which back in the days usually meant that your dynasty went extinguished. So after his death, Russia fell into total collapse. Famine, civil war, and foreign invasions followed during the so-called Time of Troubles, where the noble houses will compete for the Tsar position in a bloody Game of Thrones. Several pretenders claimed the top seat, and the boyars fought among themselves until they found a compromise solution to restore stability. They elected the 16-year-old grandnephew of Ivan's wife as the new Tsar. His youth and weak political standing made him acceptable to rival factions, and his family ties gave his rule a veneer of legitimacy. His name, Mikhail Romanov, member of the House of Romanov, who will become the chief enemy of the communist revolutionaries. This dynasty will rule for 300 years before being overthrown during the Russian Revolution. Russia's feudal system eventually hit a crisis. Western Europe's early capitalism was giving rise to powerful industries, state bureaucracies, and armies. The old boyar aristocracy, clinging to its feudal privileges and proud isolation from Europe, was being overtaken by the march of history. Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov represented a younger, militarized layer of nobility who saw that survival required modernization. Under his rule, westernization and rapid urban expansion began, not to alleviate the suffering of the people, but rather to strengthen the autocracy and prepare the foundations of early capitalism under the iron grip of an absolute monarchy. Known to history as Peter the Great, he officially established Rossiyskaya Imperia, the Russian Empire, a title used until the end of the monarchy in 1917. He founded St. Petersburg, a new city built closer to Europe, and made it Russia's capital. It would remain the seat of power until the communists moved the capital back to Moscow after the revolution. But serfdom still survives for much longer than in Europe, and becomes even more brutal with time. Serfs are by now practically indistinguishable from slaves. Like all exhausted people, the serfs began to dream of utopias. Just as the landlord class produces its ideologists, so did the peasantry. They refer to themselves as the voice of the people, the narod. The narodniki will soon unleash a wave of political actions with great consequences. After Napoleon lost the war against Russia, Alexander I expanded Russian influence and secured the throne of Poland for himself. The Russian monarchy saw the need to form an international reactionary alliance to crush the rising revolutionary bourgeois movements across Europe. Together with the Austrian Empire and Prussia, Alexander formed the Holy Alliance to act as the policeman of Europe. Just as the revolutionaries must unite and work across borders to achieve their aims, so must the great powers who want to secure their dominance, as we will see in the coming century. Whereas the bourgeois revolutions eventually succeeded in much of Western Europe, the Russian autocracy was able to crush its own, the uprising of a liberal officer elite looking to reform the old state. Russia's humiliating loss in the Crimean War against the more industrialized English and French exposed the weakness of the empire's old political structure, which constrained productive forces, and quickly emerging capitalist relations, which left the country's farming and industry underdeveloped. It became clear that the country needed to reform. That's when Alexander II, called the Tsar Liberator, introduced the Edict of Emancipation, finally removing the serf status as property. The land was now formally managed by the village commune, the Mir, which the Narodniks saw as the foundation of an agrarian socialism and a means to skip the brutal capitalist phase. A position that will receive important criticism from Russian Marxists in the future, a crucial debate which we'll cover in the next part. So, contrary to the dominating Russian narrative, it was not the empathy of the moderate reformers that achieved this supposed softening of the heart. It was a measure born out of fear of peasant rebellion, and a means to pacify the wave of riots stemming from the sharpening contradiction between productive forces and the relations of production. Naturally, this top-down supposed emancipation had calculated limits. It gave peasants very little in return for heavy debts. Their small plots couldn't feed them, and hunger was common. Many were now forced to find seasonal work in towns and industries to be able to survive and repay their debts, joining the country's growing working class. Marxist historical materialism teaches us that government policy usually reacts to changes in production, not the other way around. Since industrialization needed labor and the emerging banks needed expansion, the nobles seeking wealth in the new markets needed people that could work in factories, mines, and commercial agriculture, rather than them being tied to serfdom, which increasingly hindered productivity and mobility. While the industrial sector was still small, it was unusually highly concentrated in the brutal urban metallurgy and machine plants, especially in and around St. Petersburg or in the Donbass. And the ideological representatives of this new, quickly emerging class will soon arise. On a chill April morning in 1870, in the quiet provincial town of Simbirsk on the Volga, Europe's longest river, a new child was born in the house of the middle-class Ulyanov family. No one could have guessed that this infant, born into the order and civility of the Tsar's empire, would one day lead a movement that would turn the world upside down. In the next episode, we'll introduce the man whose arguments, concepts, and organizing efforts will represent the most revolutionary segment of Russia's downtrodden and angry proletariat. His name, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known to history as Lenin.
Okay, so we're going to start a little early, and we're doing my daily routine of reading, meditation, yoga, and martial arts. And I'm just sitting on some pillows with a blanket on my legs. I just cleaned out this whole room. I do this every day because I don't have a lot of space. I take all the stuff out, sweep and mop. I read, meditate, practice yoga and martial arts, and then I mop it again because I'll be sweating on the floor in here with my little space heater going behind me. But yeah, so we will begin with the reading. So you can hear me. I'm reading Marxism versus Identity Politics, which has uncovered some CIA declassified documents that talk about how the CIA loves to infiltrate the LGBTQ community and the activist community to try to de-emphasize the class struggle and revolutionary actions and prioritize all of these other things, which are definitely necessary, but none of that's actually going to be possible until the class struggle has been resolved, until the class war has been fought. So it's like I go to Food Not Bombs whenever I can to feed homeless people. I used to be homeless. When I was homeless, I was feeding other homeless people because I was really squared away with my camp because I had been in the military. But feeding homeless people is just treating a symptom of capitalism. Capitalism is the cause of everybody who's homeless problem. And we should feed homeless people, but we should prioritize organizing for revolution to overthrow capitalism, because that will treat the root cause, because under socialism, under communism, everybody will have housing, healthcare, education, food, and transportation. And this book talks about how the people who are sent from the government to infiltrate activist communities and movements will try to deprioritize organizing for revolution and instead prioritize the identity politics arguments and label anybody who doesn't prioritize that over actually doing the work to organize for a revolution as, bad people. So, I will go on. The politics of division. There's absolutely no doubt that racism is an important issue in capitalist society. It has always been used by the ruling class to divide and weaken the working class, setting one social group against another on grounds of ethnicity, skin color, language, etc. The struggle against racism in all its forms is therefore a priority for Marxists, who will always strive to achieve the maximum unity of the working class in its struggle against capital. In no advanced capitalist country has the fight against racism such great importance as the United States. The emergence of Black Lives Matter is the expression of the wish of millions of black people to fight back against police violence, discrimination, and racism. That is entirely progressive and must be supported. However, the tendency to theorize this phenomenon has led to exaggerations that can have negative results, particularly for the struggle of Black Americans for their just rights. Marxists fight against racism and police violence, but we are under no obligation whatsoever to accept a one-sided and false ideology that does nothing to help this struggle and everything to hinder and weaken it. Undoubtedly, there are numerous forms of oppression in addition to class exploitation, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and so on. As Marxists, we acknowledge and fight against all forms of oppression. The problem with intersectionality is that it emphasizes what divides us over what unites us, focusing on the infinite combinations of different forms of oppression and so-called, quote, privilege that each person may experience, and arguing that as a result, we all have conflicting interests. This pits different oppressed groups and layers of the working class against each other, instead of promoting the sort of collective, militant class struggle that is required to fight oppression and end class exploitation. And again, this is literally why I joined the Revolutionary Communists of America, because I would go to Freedom Road Socialist Organization meetings. When they had them, it was like once a month, and they were playing card games at these socialist meetings, and I was like, okay, I don't have time for that. And then we would go around the room speaking, and because I appear to be a white male, they wouldn't let me talk half the time. They would just skip over me and be like, no, other people need to talk first. And I get that oppressed minorities and oppressed nationalities and women need to speak, and that white men need to speak less, but that doesn't mean that I don't get to speak at all. So this is one of the many reasons I left Freedom Road Socialist Organization and I joined the Revolutionary Communists of America, because we don't waste time playing board games on the weekends. We don't waste time playing card games. And as soon as you join, you are going to get put to work, going out recruiting and fundraising, agitating, organizing, and so on, putting up posters and flyers and everything. So, I will continue. According to prominent intersectional feminist Patricia Hill Collins, quote, all groups possess varying degrees of penalty and privilege. Depending on the context, an individual may be an oppressor, a member of an oppressed group, or simultaneously oppressor and oppressed, end quote. She uses the example of white women being penalized by their gender, but privileged by their race. The problem with this viewpoint is that it suggests that if a person doesn't experience a given form of oppression, then they are an oppressor who has an interest in maintaining that form of oppression over others. This focus on the individual as the primary perpetrator of oppression only serves to further atomize the struggles of the oppressed. Furthermore, no one layer of the working class has any interest in maintaining the oppression of any other. Precisely the opposite. Instead of uniting all oppressed people in a common struggle against capitalism and the bourgeois state, the quote intersectionalists want to break down the struggle into smallest component parts, pitting black women against black men, black disabled women against black able-bodied women, etc. By breaking down and separating things in this way, they are dividing the movement, diverting attention from the main issues, and pitting different groups of the oppressed against each other. Thus, every separate segment is invited to assert our rights against your rights. The movement, thus, is broken into smaller and smaller parts. In the meantime, the real oppressors, the bankers and capitalists, the newspaper barons and police chiefs, the reactionaries and racists, rub their hands and watch in glee as the movement consumes its energy in a myriad of senseless squabbles and conflicts. This leads to attacks by some activists against other activists for their supposed ranking in a hierarchy of privilege. Thus, black men are said to be privileged compared to black women, and so on. The list is endless, and the inevitable result is the atomization of the movement into 1,000 fragments. Instead of fighting against the common enemy, every segment of the oppressed is encouraged to focus on their own form of oppression and arguing against every other segment of the oppressed. Rather than mass struggle, small groups of activists engage in their own isolated battles over particular issues. But matters do not end there. Taken to its logical conclusions, no organization is possible as inevitably every individual is unique and has their own unique experience of capitalism. Talk of, quote, allies and coming together is merely a cover to obscure the divisive approach that they advocate. An example of the absurd extremes to which these ideas lead is the reaching fear over the transphobia of radical feminists like Julie Bindel, Germaine Greer, and others, who have made a number of inflammatory comments about transgender women, basically accusing them of, quote, not being real women. This is an expression of the obsession of identity politics with defining which category someone is in. Furthermore, instead of politically challenging ideas they disagree with, both sides respond with boycotts, no platforming, protests, and hooliganism that shuts down events and prevents debate. If it is true that every segment of oppressed people experiences oppression in a different way, it can be argued with equal validity that each separate individual also experiences things differently, and therefore no person can understand my problems, which are my personal property. This argument leads us right back to the philosophical morass of subjective idealism that Lenin demolished so comprehensively in Materialism and Imperial Criticism. The subjective idealism inherent to intersectionality is exposed in its crudest form in the following passage by Patricia Hill Collins. Quote, the overarching matrix of domination houses multiple groups, each with varying experiences with penalty and privilege that produce corresponding partial perspectives. No one group has a clear angle of vision. No one group possesses the theory or methodology that allows it to discover the absolute, quote, truth. And again, they're saying this is subjective idealism that obscures the real issue, which is the class war that we have to overthrow capitalism in order to resolve. And in the bottom line, at the end of the day, whatever you want to say, the fundamental truth is that there is a real world, there is an objective reality, and you cannot continuously divide the movement along all these lines and expect to get progress. We have to be united under one red flag all over the world in order to overthrow capitalism. Moving on, class standpoint abandoned. In any of the articles and speeches by adherents of, quote, intersectionality, one rarely finds any mention of class, much less the working class. In those rare moments when class is mentioned, it is not expressed in a Marxist way, but as a form of discrimination, quote, classism. Just one of many, and by no means the most important. The working class is no longer the producer of all wealth, exploited in the productive process, but only one more category of people who are, quote, discriminated against. Yet another sad case of ex-leftists who have completely abandoned the standpoint of communism and socialist revolution. Rather than find the root of oppression in class society and, under capitalism, in economic domination of the bankers and capitalists, the quote intersectionalists try to find it in the social behavior of people and the language they use. In their view, women's oppression today is not a result of capitalist wage slavery, but as a result of the use of discriminatory language or of discriminatory structures in organizations. In the former colonial countries, as a result of the ideological bankruptcy of Stalinism, different groups or tendencies sought, after the triumph of the Chinese and Cuban revolutions, a new, more original form outside the, quote, Marxist orthodoxy, a new philosophy of liberation. This alleged philosophy argues that the key to the liberation of the ex-colonial countries is to do away with Eurocentric thought and language, and this will lead to an epistemological and thought decolonization. This will be the basis for understanding the history of these countries in an original way, and they will begin their liberation. This reformist and reactionary thinking invites us not to fight against the bourgeoisie and its brutal forms of exploitation, but to find, epistemologically speaking, new ways forward. From this point of view, what is required is not a revolution aimed at the radical reconstruction of society from the foundations, but reform and a change in people's mentality and conduct. The aim is not to change society, but to strive for individual self-fulfillment in the abstract. Never mind the fact that as long as capitalism continues, so too will exploitation and oppression. The Revolutionary Party is a tool for the working class to take power and transform society. It is not a miniature copy of the new society, but the catalyst for creating it. It goes without saying that we combat any expression of oppression in our ranks and in our political activity. However, intersectionalists imagine that they can build a pure organization that is purged of discriminatory behavior, capable of creating a society free of discrimination. They do not understand that any organization will be under pressure from the society in which it is built. For example, the oppression of women under capitalism makes it unlikely that we will have equal representation of men and women in most organizations as long as capitalism exists. We must remove all barriers for women and other oppressed groups to participate, but we cannot remove the pressures of class society as long as class society itself exists. The intersectionalists end up focusing all their energy into building this utopian prototype of the future society within the confines of the old, instead of building the organization that can actually end this society and its discriminatory behavior. This idealist conception is a complete negation of the materialist and dialectical conception of society. The idealist conception also finds its way into the types of reforms, quote, end quote, that part of this movement put forward, quote, gender-neutral language, gender-neutral bringing up of children, etc. But by such means of the, quote, intersectionalists imagine that somehow the root of oppression is to be found in bad ideas that can simply be, quote, educated away, a completely reformist and utopian concept. Different schools of feminism, ? And that's in quotes. In the last few years, we have witnessed mass movements against oppression and discrimination in several countries. From the initial Black Lives Matter movement against the police killing of young black people to the same-sex referendum in Ireland, the movement in defense of abortion rises in Poland, in defense of abortion rights in Poland, and the movement against violence on women in Argentina, Mexico, and other countries. These movements reflect a progressive feeling which we must connect with and contain an element of questioning of the system as a whole. In Spain, the March 8 strike and the movement against La Manada, Wolfpack, gang rapists, involving hundreds of thousands, even millions, took place under the name of feminism. In the eyes of the masses, the word has acquired the meaning of, quote, struggle for women's equality. However, the leaders of the organization calling for the March 8, quote, feminist strike are feminists in the sense of adhering to feminist theory. They argue that the struggle for women's liberation must be, quote, transversal, cutting across class and political lines. That men can be at best, quote, allies, and should not have participated in the strike, but rather their role should have been to replace women strikers in their jobs, and also promote the idea that exploitation of women under capitalism takes place in the reproduction of labor, and therefore we should fight for, quote, wages for housework. In the movement, as the movement became a mass movement, most of the participants would not have been aware of many of these ideas. In these conditions, some comrades have raised the idea that we should adopt the word feminism and describe ourselves as such. We don't think this is a correct nor necessary. Of course, it would be a serious political mistake to start our arguments in writing and in our intervention with a polemic over the meaning of the word feminism. What we need to do, as any intervention in a mass movement, is to use its most progressive and revolutionary aspects and propose in a positive way our own program and strategy. We have to argue in a comradely way against the wrong and counterproductive ideas put forward by the leaders of the movement, while linking up with the revolutionary spirit which inspires its ranks. This is what we have done so far, in places like Mexico, Italy, where there was a mass movement around March 8 in 2017, and Spain. The fact that we do not call ourselves feminist has not been an obstacle for our intervention. Many young men and women call themselves feminists without actually being such from a Marxist point of view. They are beginning to be aware of inequality in society, and what they mean by calling themselves feminists is that they are against oppression of women and want an equal society. That can be a starting point for being one to revolutionary Marxist ideas. Feminists often blame the, quote, patriarchy for most of the problems of society. It is true that the enslavement of women in the oldest form of slavery, the enslavement of women is the oldest form of slavery, which arose alongside class domination and has existed for thousands of years. Only a fundamental reconstruction of society can end this abominable theory once and for all. But such a fundamental change can only be brought about by the united revolutionary action of the working class. That presupposes the unity in action of working class men and women fighting for their emancipation as a class. Feminists tend to see patriarchy as a structure separate from that of class society, which leads to the inevitable conclusion that the struggle for the emancipation of women is separate from that of the emancipation of the working class. This is a reactionary and divisive idea, which is also present, albeit in diluted forms, among many who call themselves Marxist feminists and socialist feminists. The full emancipation of women can only be achieved by a social revolution, which will abolish the exploitation upon which oppression of women is based. Does that mean that we ignore the struggle for the advancement of, for example, women under capitalism? Of course not. We will fight against even the smallest manifestation of discrimination and the oppression of women. That is the prior condition for achieving the militant unity of all workers. It is sometimes argued that there are different feminist schools of thought, and this is undoubtedly the case. It is also the case that there are many different kinds of anarchism, and some are closer to Marxism than others. But that does not change the fact that there is a clear dividing line between genuine Marxism and anarchism. Although there are different kinds of anarchism, they all have the same kinds of prejudices to one degree or another. The way to win over those anarchists who are closer to communism is not to pretend these differences do not exist, or to say to the anarchists, you see, we really are fighting for the same thing. Quite the contrary. The way to dispel the confusion of an honest anarchist is to explain the difference between the confused and unscientific ideas of anarchism and the clear scientific ideas of revolutionary Marxism. At the time of the Russian Revolution, some described themselves as, quote, communist anarchists. As a result of the experience of the revolution, the best proletarian elements among the anarchists moved closer to Bolshevism and fought side by side with the Bolsheviks in the Revolution and the Civil War. Many of them joined the Communist Party. The tendency of anarcho-communism represented a kind of halfway house or transitional stage in the movement towards communism. In the same manner, it may be the case that some kinds of feminism are more progressive than others. Marxists must fight with every means at our disposal for the complete emancipation of women. One might ask, what is feminism? That is a question that it is quite impossible to answer in any definitive way. It is a term used by both conservatives and liberals, progressives and left-wingers. It is used to advocate the invasion of Afghanistan on the grounds of protecting women's rights, and at the same time, people who want to fight for equality and the liberation of humankind use it. In fact, even in Spain, the right-wing ruling party also used purple feminist ribbons on March 8th to show that they are, quote, feminist too. The Oxford Dictionary defines it as the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of the equality of the sexes. That definition shows the central problem of the term, that it says nothing at all, really, from a class perspective. Feminism might be best defined by what it is not. It does not give any answer as to how oppression arose and hence how it can be combated and removed. All the different kinds of feminism have their own answers, if they have any at all. Feminism implies that somehow it is possible to remove oppression of women before removing the root cause of the oppression, capitalism and class society in general. Instead of clarifying, it blurs the class lines. All the different kinds of feminism only look at the symptoms and not the root causes. As Marxists, we have to state what is. We need a clear line of demarcation to feminism. That is not because we do not fight for, quote, women's rights on the ground of the equality of the sexes, which of course we do, but because even the best kind of feminism only creates confusion and a false sense of unity across class lines. Therefore, it makes no sense to declare ourselves Marxist feminist. Actually, it is directly counterproductive, and it does not help clarify the question for the honest, young class fighters who call themselves feminists. On the contrary, we have to explain openly why we are not feminists as a means to help these people on the road to Marxism, and so as not to create a bridge for petty bourgeois, non-class ideas and philosophical idealism to slip into the ranks of the Marxists. Although we cannot declare ourselves to be feminists, we must not give the impression that we are in any way indifferent to the deep-seated sense of indignation felt by the working class mass of women who suffer both in their position as workers and women under capitalism. Nor should we give any credence to the false idea that Marxists subordinate the struggle for the liberation of women to a distant socialist future. Under the banner of feminism, despite all its contradictions and limitations, a new generation of women are moving into struggle against the present state of things. Setting out from this concrete situation and recognizing its revolutionary potential, we must find a way to link the age-old oppression of women with the concrete conditions of the era of capitalist decay. Similarly, when working as revolutionaries within the trade unions, we participate in the day-to-day struggles of fellow workers, whilst also demanding fighting unions and socialist policies. In the same way, we must participate in every mass movement of women, striving to give it the most militant character and linking the immediate demands to the need for fundamental change in society. It is our obligation to bridge the transition between the democratic aspirations of women and their fight for equality, with the idea of common struggle of all workers against an oppressive system, emphasizing the need to unite to strike the final blow against capitalism, which always seeks to divide the oppressed class to perpetuate its domination. By saying you are a, quote, Marxist feminist, you end up implying that Marxism does not encompass the fight for equality. It is true that Stalinism did not, but just as we fight a battle against Stalinism to reclaim the Marxist heritage, we must do so in this field. We argue that Stalinism is not Marxism, and the Stalinist bureaucratic regime was not socialism. And in the same manner, we must argue that Stalinist view of women, homosexuals, etc., has nothing in common with Marxism. By defining the category women includes women of all classes, classes which have irreconcilable interests. As it blurs these decisive class distinctions and contradictions, feminism cannot be reconciled with Marxism, which starts with a class analysis. If we are to win over the feminists moving towards Marxism, this can only be done by being absolutely firm in our principles. We must repeatedly stress that the full emancipation of women can only be achieved through class unity in the socialist revolution. There are those who call themselves feminists because they defend women's rights. Marxists also defend women's rights, though we are not feminists. In any case, we need to explain in a comradely way that we do not oppose their struggle. Quite the opposite. We are in favor of women's rights, but we think they can be achieved through the struggle against capitalism, not by dividing. At the same time, we must be at the forefront of every struggle against discrimination and inequality. Struggling for even the smallest demand that tends to advance the cause of equality and opposes any form of oppression or discrimination, such as universal employment with equal pay for work of equal value, an end to austerity which disproportionately affects women, cutting their wages and forcing them to do more household work, caring for the young and the elderly to make up for lack of social services. Right to abortion. Free, equal health care for all, including unrestricted access to free family planning, abortion, and domestic violence centers. Fully paid parental leave. Massive program of social housing. An extensive network of free and high-quality nurseries covering actual working hours. Free and high-quality elderly care, both residential and non-residential. The provision of free catering and laundry services. Free, high-quality canteens at work and in schools. Oppose and fight against violence against women. However, the prior condition for a successful struggle in the workplace is the unity of men and women workers as workers. The fundamental line of demarcation is that Marxism explains society in class terms, not in terms of gender. The most fundamental division in society is that between workers and capitalists, exploited and exploiters. That there are other kinds of oppression is also true, but in the last analysis, not one of these can be solved on the basis of capitalism. As on every other issue, wages, pensions, housing, health, working conditions, the day-to-day struggle for advance under capitalism is the only way to mobilize and organize the working class in preparation for the overthrow of capitalism, in which women workers will play an absolutely vital role. We of course welcome the fact that there are feminists who have begun to understand the limitations of feminism, but this positive trend can only have significance as a transitional stage that leads finally to the adoption of a consistently revolutionary class point of view. The complete emancipation of women will be achieved through the triumph of the socialist revolution, or it will not be achieved at all. So on that note, I will end the daily reading, and we will now sit quietly and think about these ideas and the ideas and teachings of Lenin from the historical experiences and his writings. So we're doing right now a series on Lenin, listening to every Lenin audiobook that we can find. Okay.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the June 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of the development of revolutionary strikes and street demonstrations by Lenin from 1913. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Social Democrat number 30, January 12, 1913, and published according to the text in Social Democrat. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1975, Moscow, Volume 18. Translated by Stepan Apresian, HTML transcription and markup by R. Symbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So, this piece was from January 1913, which was still almost 5 years off from the October Revolution of 1917, but certainly after the first Russian Revolution of 1905. This period had ups and downs, but overall it did see the buildup of revolutionary activity between the first Russian Revolution in 1905, when certain reforms were exacted from the Tsarist government, and then February 1917, when the Tsar was deposed and a capitalist-led provisional government was installed, and then finally later that year, October, when the socialists overthrew the provisional capitalist government. Also, this piece is the fourth and final installment of a little mini-series that I did during the June 2022 edition of Socialism for All by Lenin about strikes and demonstrations. The pieces uploaded for this were on strikes from 1899, economic and political strikes from 1912, draft of a new law on strikes from 1902, and this piece, development of revolutionary strikes and street demonstrations from 1913. So let's get into the text. It has long since been pointed out and recognized by all that the year 1912 was an outstanding landmark in the development of the strike movement, but not all have realized and taken proper account of it. Let us take the data on political strikes in the first 11 months of the year. The result is as follows. 1905 saw 1,052,000 political strikers. 1906, 642,000. 1907, 540,000. Then a gap. Then in 1912, about 900,000. The number of political strikers in the first 9 months was 700,000, according to the most conservative estimates. Strikes in connection with clearing up the matter of the delegates in St. Petersburg involved up to 50,000 people. The strikes in protest against the Sevastopol executions, and the strike on November 15, the day when the Duma, or Parliament, opened, involved 188,000 persons, according to the Moscow Manufacturers Society. These data are for the period before November 20. Obviously, 900,000 is a minimum figure. Even subtracting 100,000 that are hardly comparable with 1905 to 1907, factories outside the province of the factory inspectorate, we get 800,000. In any case, the movement definitely surpassed that in 1906 and 1907, and fell only slightly short of that in 1905. What does this mean? The national scale of the movement at present is, of course, much smaller than in 1905. Consequently, the beginning of the revolutionary upswing is incomparably higher today than it was before the first revolution. Consequently, the coming second revolution, even now, reveals a much greater store of revolutionary energy in the proletariat. The proletariat has grown in numbers by a minimum of 20%. Its concentration has increased. The purely proletarian mainstay of the movement has become stronger due to accelerated dissociation from the land. The size of the proletarian and semi-proletarian population in domestic industry, handicrafts, and agriculture has grown to an enormous extent, defying calculation. Lastly, there has been an increase in the political consciousness, experience, and determination of the foremost democratic class. This is admitted by all, but not all can bring themselves to think out all the implications. Not all can bring themselves to face the truth and admit that we are witnessing revolutionary mass strikes, the beginning of a revolutionary upsurge. This is indicated first and foremost by the fundamental and most objective fact, one least of all permitting of subjective interpretation, namely the scope of the movement. In no country of the world would it be possible, unless there were a revolutionary social situation, to rouse hundreds of thousands of workers to political action for the most varied reasons, several times a year. But in our country, this rise is taking place spontaneously, because tens of millions of the semi-proletarian and peasant population are passing on, if one can use this expression, to their vanguard, a sentiment of concentrated indignation, which is surging up and overflowing. The Russian workers' revolutionary strike in 1912 was national in the fullest sense of the term, for what should be understood by a national movement is not at all one with which, in the conditions of a bourgeois democratic revolution or capitalist revolution, the whole bourgeoisie, or at least the liberal bourgeoisie, is in agreement. Only opportunists hold that view. On the contrary, a national movement is one which expresses the objective needs of the whole country and aims its heaviest blows at the central forces of the enemy opposing the country's development. A national movement is one which has the sympathy of the vast majority of the population. Such precisely is the workers' political movement this year, a movement which has the sympathy of all working and exploited people, of all Democrats, however weak, downtrodden, disunited, and helpless they may be. The more definite demarcation between liberalism and democracy, achieved not without a struggle against those who aspired to, quote, wrest the Duma from the hands of the reactionaries, is a tremendous advantage of the new movement. If the revolution is to succeed, it must know as exactly as possible with whom it can go into battle, which of its allies is unreliable, and who is its real enemy. That is why the direct actions of the liberals, the Cadet Party, against the new revolution are so very significant. And that is why the slogan of a republic, which clears the minds of all Democrats willing to fight from the monarchist, as well as, quote, constitutional illusions which sapped so much the strength of the onslaught in 1905, is of the most exceptional importance, by comparison with Europe, in Russia just now. Of historic importance in the process of growth of the new revolution in Russia are two factors. Firstly, the April and May strikes, during which the St. Petersburg workers, in spite of the arrest of their leading organization, the St. Petersburg Committee, put forward the slogan of a republic, an 8-hour working day, and confiscation of the landed estates. Secondly, the November strikes and demonstrations, see letters from Riga and Moscow. The same thing happened in St. Petersburg, but the arrests swept away our correspondence. Footnote there, this refers to reports from Riga and Moscow about workers' strikes and demonstrations, published in Social Democrat number 30 on January 12, 1913. On November 11, 1912, the Riga workers organized a protest demonstration against the death sentences on a group of sailors of the battleship Ioan Zlatoust, passed by a court-martial in Sevastopol, against the torturing of political prisoners and against the war that had begun in the Balkans. Over 1,500 workers marched through the streets of Riga singing revolutionary songs and carrying red flags. They were received sympathetically by the population. On November 12, many large factories in the city began a political strike. On November 8, the workers in a number of Moscow factories went on strike in protest against the Sevastopol executions. There was also a demonstration, but the police boom dispersed it. Continuing, the slogans of those demonstrations were not only down with the death penalty, down with war, but also long live the revolutionary working class and the revolutionary army. In the streets of St. Petersburg, Riga, and Moscow, the proletariat held out its hand to those foremost fighters of the Mujik armed forces who had risen heroically against the monarchy. And I just want to comment here, Lenin talks about the historic importance in the process of growth of the new revolution, there being two factors. So one of them is these revolutionary strikes, putting forward the slogan of a republic, 8-hour working day, confiscation of the landed estates, and then slogans of other demonstrations, down with the death penalty, down with war, etc. We need to organize, not just on social media, but organize in real life to make these demands and launch large-scale demonstrations. This is how you actually pick up real-world momentum, okay? The social media, it's there, great. We have, a means of communicating within the movement and also from the movement to the population at large. But you also have to join and build left parties that are embracing this kind of message. And, the Democratic Party is a party of capital, even the, quote, progressive wing of it, that's never going to be any good. The Green Party is the bare minimum, and then there are other left parties. I think that probably what we really need is a coalition of all the left parties working together on goals that are commonly shared. I think that that is practical and realistic. But, making these demands loudly in public and picking up more support as we go. confining it just to online really doesn't work long run. Continuing. The liberal bourgeoisie is against a new revolution, against revolutionary mass strikes. Just a comment here, when Lenin talks about a new revolution, so this is again 1913, first month of 1913, he's talking about, a new revolution. Well, what was the old revolution? So again, that's the revolution of 1905, when some concessions were wrested from the Tsarist government. And so the bourgeoisie made out okay in the 1905 revolution. He's saying that they're against another one. Like, they're happy with the reforms that they got there, and so they're against revolutionary mass strikes because they feared that, if there was another revolution, that this could maybe not go the way of capitalism, but go towards the workers. And indeed, that's exactly what happened in 1917. But just to show, the liberal capitalists, they are supportive of a certain amount of revolution and reform, but again, only to the point that benefits them to set up capitalism on what they think is going to be a long-term basis. Continuing. But the liberals are by no means opposed to political strikes in general. That is, if these are only evidence of a revival and support merely the liberal slogan of constitutional reform. And objectively, irrespective of their good intentions, our liquidators are mere servants of the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie. They marked both historic moments of the upswing by pronouncements against revolutionary strikes. In Nevsky Golos, number 1, on May 20, 1912, the unforgettable and incomparable V. Yezhov rebelled against, quote, complicating economic strikes by political strikes, and vice versa, against their, quote, harmful lumping together. And footnote there, we've covered that on the channel along with notes on liquidationism and what that is in Lenin's Economic and Political Strikes from 1912. Continuing. In November 1912, the liquidationist Luch, too, was up in arms against strikes. Afterwards, it tried to put inattentive people on a false scent by referring to the fact that the Social Democratic group, too, was against the November 15 strike. But anyone who looks at all into the meaning of the event will easily see through Luch's trickery. Yes, both the Social Democratic group and the St. Petersburg Committee found the November 15 strike inopportune. They sounded a warning against that particular strike on that particular day. It was the duty of the working class press to report this, and Luch and Pravda did. But Luch did something else besides. After the event of November 15, when the most zealous in striking was the very same Vyborg district, which until then had been most of all linked with the Mensheviks, and after the movement had grown to the dimensions of a demonstration, the sagacious Luch carried articles, an editorial, and following the editorial of November 17, a feuilleton on November 21st, crying out against the, quote, dangerous frittering way of forces, declaring that, quote, if strikes are used frequently, people will stop sympathizing with them. Advancing the slogan, let us seek a different path, and nothing is to be gained by outbreaks, and howling against, quote, playing at strikes. That is the kind of, quote, philosophy advocated by you liquidator gentlemen, and long familiar to the St. Petersburg workers, both from Nevsky Golos and from speeches by members of your, quote, initiating group, that has gained you the legitimate hatred and contempt of the St. Petersburg workers. A particular strike may be unfortunate or take place at an unfortunate moment, but only liberals and counter-revolutionaries are free to describe as, quote, playing at strikes, one of the world's greatest movements, which brought into action almost 1 million proletarians. Frequent strikes are apt to exhaust the workers. It may well be, therefore, that we shall have to call for shorter strikes and for demonstrations that have been better prepared. But the event of November 15 was remarkable precisely as a new step forward in the demonstration movement. Instead of honestly admitting your mistake, for you were plainly mistaken as to the significance of November 15, you liquidators began to talk, like the most brazen liberals, about the, quote, political illiteracy of the revolutionary appeal, you who are repeating the ABC of liberal politics. Let the workers judge the worth of the liquidators' smooth-spoken talk about their, quote, unity with the party, when it happens that, at the time of the rise and development of revolutionary strikes and demonstrations, the liquidators launch a struggle against them, using the legal press to revile illegal appeals. However, There is a more profound reason for the liquidators' campaign against strikes. The liquidators are slaves of the liberals, and the liberals have really begun to feel ill at ease because of the stubborn character of revolutionary strikes. The, quote, progressist factory owner has begun to grumble and even to rage. The Milyakovs now fear lest their bloc with Rodzianko should be disturbed. Liquidationist policy serves to subject the workers to the liberals. Marxist policy raises the workers to the role of leaders of the peasantry. One cannot speak of this legally, liquidator gentlemen, but one must think of it and tell about it to those who want to be revolutionary social democrats. In free constitutional Europe, political strikes for the time being, so long as the socialist revolution has not yet begun, serve the struggle for individual reforms. In slave, Asiatic, Tsarist Russia, which is drawing near her next bourgeois democratic revolution, political strikes are the only serious means of stirring up the peasantry and the better part of the peasant army, of shaking them up and rousing them to a revolutionary struggle. The time is past, fortunately for Russia, when there was no one to, quote, go among the people, but heroic solidary narodniks, populists. The time is passing when solitary terrorists could speak of, quote, rousing the people by terrorism. Russia has left those sad times behind. In 1905, the revolutionary proletariat found for itself a different way to go among the people and a different means of drawing the masses into the movement. That means is revolutionary strikes, stubborn strikes shifting from place to place, from one part of the country to another, recurrent strikes, strikes which rouse the backward to a new life of struggle for economic improvements, strikes which brand and lash every salient act of violence or tyranny, every crime of Tsarism, strike demonstrations which unfurl the red banner in the streets of the capital cities and bring revolutionary speeches and revolutionary slogans to the crowd, to the mass of the people. Such strikes cannot be called forth artificially, but neither can they be stopped once they have begun to involve hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Let the liberal, who is moved by being given a seat beside Rodzianko, tell the workers, quote, brothers, no more outbreaks, seek a different path, take up the peaceful trade union movement, prepare yourselves earnestly for an open European party. Don't incite the mujik to rebellion, don't waste your energy on strikes, or we shall stop sympathizing with you. The workers will know how to assess such talk, and they will see through it even in the garb of the, quote, near-Marxist expressions of any of the Lutsch writers. The workers will concentrate on deliberately supporting, strengthening, developing, and consolidating the spontaneously growing revolutionary strike to prepare the peasants and the armed forces for a rising. If strikes exhaust the workers, they should be carried out intermittently, enabling some of the forces to rest, while the forces that are rested or fresh are roused up to take the struggle. Shorter strikes should be called. Occasionally, strikes should be replaced by demonstrations. But the important thing is that strikes, meetings, and demonstrations should take place continuously. That the whole peasantry and the armed forces should know of the workers' stubborn fight, and that the countryside, even the most out-of-the-way corners of it, should see that there is unrest in the towns, that, quote, their people have risen in revolt, that they are waging a life-and-death struggle, that they are fighting for a better life, for higher pay, for an end to the outrages and tyranny of the authorities, for the transfer of the landed estates to the peasants, for the overthrow of the Tsar's landlord monarchy, for a republic. It is essential that the smoldering resentment and subdued murmurings of the countryside should, along with the indignation in the barracks, find a center of attraction in the workers' revolutionary strikes. We must work on this indefatigably, and we shall live to see the day when the proletariat, jointly with the peasantry and the armed forces, brings down the landlords and overthrows the Tsarist monarchy by a people's uprising. P.S. Lutsch is making progress. After the unsophisticated VA, number 56, comes the diplomatic FD, number 65. Footnote there, VA was V.M. Abrasimov, a Menshevik liquidator, subsequently exposed as an agent provocateur. Also, FD was F.I. Don, leader of the Menshevik liquidators. Back to the text. But for all his, quote, diplomacy, the meaning of FD's statements is the same. He is against revolutionary strikes. We are faced with an out-and-out liberal to whom it never occurs that strikes awaken the peasants and lead them to insurrection, that strikes develop revolutionary agitation among the masses and awaken the armed forces, and that it is necessary to pass from strikes, insofar as they are exhausting, to street demonstrations, etc. FD's vulgar liberal phrases about the struggle for the right to organize as the, quote, immediate task, a constitutional reform, quote, on the order of the day under Treschenko, is the sole cover for Luch's fight against revolutionary strikes. It is not enough, liquidator gentlemen. And that's the end of the audiobook. So basically what Lenin is saying here is that when people are getting out in the streets by, the hundreds of thousands, this is a positive sign. You want to see that. Individual strikes, individual demonstrations, people can quibble about whether this one was perfectly strategic, perfectly opportune or not. But the fact is, you want a rising tide of people who are indignant enough that they're getting out in the streets and making themselves heard, taking what direct actions they can to advance their own class interests, and trying to communicate their message to the rest of the working population to try to spread that sentiment and pull more people into the movement. This is how we need to be mobilizing people, by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions, by the tens of millions. Currently in 2022 USA, people are getting up the courage to post more and more things on social media and to engage in conversation there with other people about what's appropriate next steps and what kind of demands should working people be making, and so on and so on. The problem with social media is that it's really skewed. Certain figures are way louder than others, and not because they're well organized with a lot of people backing them, but because they have money to navigate the media environment, even the alternative media. And so when somebody comes in, what people tend to see first. They're not necessarily the best, it's just this sort of skewed playing field. You can't really trust that because it's not necessarily supported by any kind of grassroots organic movement of widespread support. On social media, as part of marketing, you can buy followers, you can buy likes on posts, you can buy retweets, you can buy and it doesn't matter. YouTube, SoundCloud, it does not matter. Everywhere can be gamed and manipulated. So social media is good for a lot of people, getting out there and talking to other people and sharing particular things. There is a lot there that is grassroots and organic. However, some of the loudest voices are standing on top of a lot of money, and even when they claim to talk about socialism or just progressive politics generally, or populist politics, whatever, these are not really the best, most informed representations of what working people should be doing right now in terms of our politics and organizing. Many of them are, we'll just go ahead and say, flat out grifters who are teaching such bastardized versions of politics that they need to be completely unlearned before people who have sort of gotten off on that foot can really get started in the real world fighting for their own interests. So where do we go from here? Again, we're having more of a national conversation in the US about capitalism. This is really a step forward. That happened after 2008, and you saw it with Occupy, etc. Capitalism had not really been on the table up for discussion for a very long time prior to that. People just didn't really talk about it. Now, you're seeing more and more people just openly embracing socialism. It doesn't always mean Marxism, but you're seeing people at least starting to adopt the label again. And of course, some of you have made it out to channels like this, which are Marxist, Leninist, etc. So these are steps forward, but we still have a lot to do in the real world once people have, gone through sort of socialist school or boot camp for a couple of years in this whole political media online environment. Once you sort of know what you're doing, you have to take it to your community and join the fight. Or in some cases, start the fight, or pick up the fight after somebody else, put down the torch for a while, whatever it is. But you need to be involved in that. I'm reminded here of somebody asked me recently in the comments, what was, Lenin's role in this? How did Lenin see himself as a leader, etc.? So it's important to understand Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and they weren't all just having a conversation. They were factions within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, an organized political force that actually had representatives in the government. They were not merely tweeting at each other, in other words. They were not merely writing articles and doing reactions and responses to each other. They were actually involved in the process of building political power in the real world and then advancing that within the government, within the parallel government, the Soviets, within the trade unions, on and on and on. So this is something that is sorely lacking in the United States. Obviously, there are major challenges within the election system of the United States, which in many ways is just sort of for display purposes only. But a concerted coalition of left forces could certainly take it on and find some way to make inroads somewhere. And of course, elections, that's just one form of class struggle. There are many other avenues that need to be followed simultaneously, and the strategizing for that simply can't happen within a capital-dominated party like the Democratic Party. So, you'll hear Social Democrats often say, by the way, just to make a distinction here, when Lenin talks about Social Democrats back in 1912, this was the general term for Marxists. There wasn't the split yet of what we would call Social Democrats today, who are reformist, welfare capitalists, versus, socialists or communists today who believe in abolishing capitalism entirely. So just a difference to be noted there. Anyway, when Social Democrats of today, the reformist welfare capitalist type, talk about, we got to run as Democrats, or we're using the Democratic Party as a tool. First of all, no, you're not. It's using you. But you say, we got to win as Democrats. What I would say to that is, even when you, quote, win as a Democrat, you lose in the overall class struggle. First of all, the Democratic Party is going to hollow out your positions because eventually they will sanction you in one way or another, really preventing you from pursuing anything of worth there. Second of all, it's not a suitable organizing hub, which that is what needs to come first and foremost. You need an organizing hub, a party which is free of bourgeois influence, where workers can come together and talk about working class interests and strategize and plan for class struggle far beyond just engaging in the electoral system. And the Democratic Party is just completely unsuitable for that. Anyway, when Lenin was writing this stuff, he wasn't just sort of, writing it for general informational purposes. He was at the head of a revolutionary party organized of many, many people that was engaged in real-world struggle. This is just simply not the case with most of the U.S. left. I've said many times, U.S. left seems to have two modes. One, trying to reform the Democratic Party, which is not reformable, and then two, dropping out and sort of doing nothing but talking. That is just simply not going to fly at this point. People have to get organized and truly engage in struggle in planned, strategic, organized ways with an eye towards building this up and creating revolutionary change, not just tweeting hashtag general strike or, when some story about a landlord comes up, posting a Mao meme. I mean, that serves a certain purpose in terms of agitating and spreading the message about alternatives to capitalism. But you can't actually affect change by doing that alone. That is where organization comes in. You just simply have to join and build one or more workers, parties, organizations, etc., and do that difficult but vital process. We read Lenin, we read Mao, etc. today. Why? Because they showed that their ideas and the ways that they carried them out were effective in liberating people, in actually following through on the desires, the aspirations of the working class for liberation from capitalism. Simply just tweeting about it is not enough. Simply just posting on Facebook about it or any other social media is not enough. Again, media, it's important for communicating, for sharing information, for agitating, and so on. But if this isn't tied to some real-world organizing and pretty quick, we're never going to see the sort of buildup of revolutionary activity that has been described in this little mini-series here, or really in anything else on the channel. To take one example, look at the uprisings of 2020. There were mass demonstrations all over the United States against police brutality, against racist capitalism, which Really, racism underpins capitalism in the United States. They're deeply intertwined. The entire history of US capitalism is closely interwoven with racism and ethnic and religious discrimination and prejudice, and with sexism, and with heterosexism, and on and on. All forms of bigotry are closely interwoven with capitalism. But while a lot of people did get radicalized by the demonstrations, by the conversations that were had then, there was some really good struggle happening that honestly to me was like a breath of fresh air. It was like finally people in the US standing up, not taking it anymore. It's been disconcertingly, disappointingly quiet since then. But anyway, what happened? It got co-opted by the Democratic Party. Why? Because organized political forces can do that. So if workers don't want to habitually, repeatedly be co-opted and have whatever we build up spun into either the Democratic Party or into sort of the right populist, MAGA fascist vortex, whatever it is, if you want to hang on to that energy for yourself, you have to get organized as an independent force capable of historic action on your own. The US left simply is not organized in such a way now. And it seems hostile, disdainful of organizing. You have to put this behind you. Just suck it up, join something, start fighting. Otherwise, all the energy that you put into this struggle, you might as well just pour it directly down the drain, because it's going to have fleeting impact and it's just not going to be fed into something larger, something that lasts, something that can be built up over time, honed and used as a weapon against capitalism. This is what we want. We want that weapon. We are that weapon, but only if we organize. All right, I'm going to leave it there for this video. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, we don't run ads on this channel, so that support is vital. Head to patreon.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful and have allowed me to spend a lot more time creating content for this channel than I would have been able to do without that support, so I really appreciate it. Also, after the content has been created and uploaded, engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, even if it's thanks, good video, random letters, whatever it is. But all of that really helps. The channel has been growing steadily. We're on the road to a subscriber base of 10,000 as I record this. We're at like 8,250 right now. That is phenomenal. That's outstanding. And that is because people like you have been showing up, have been engaging with the videos, have been sharing it with other people. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people educated. So congratulations to us all for taking steps away from liberalism, from wherever you came from politically. Good for you for stepping away from it and coming to learn Marxism, because this works. Everything else just sort of plays to the capitalists and doesn't change anything. So thanks again, and we will see you hopefully in the streets and in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the May 2023 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of May Day Action by the Revolutionary Proletariat by Lenin from 1913. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was first published in Social Democrat number 31, June 15, 1913, and published here according to that text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1977, Moscow, Volume 19. Translated by the late George Hanna, transcribed by R. Cimbala, HTML markup by B. Baggins and D. Walters, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive. Thanks as usual to MIA-Marxists.org for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So, earlier this week was May 1st, May Day, International Workers' Day, the real Labor Day, not the fake one that the United States has, which was specifically separated out from May Day in order to try to break off U.S. workers from having international solidarity and demonstrations with other workers around the world. So in celebration of that, we're reading this article from Russian Labor and Revolutionary History. So what was going on around this time? In fact, Lenin is going to introduce us to some of the events going on in 1913. But as more background, the first Russian Revolution was in 1905. This was basically a period from 1905 to 1907 when major concessions were won from the Tsarist government. Now, at that time, Russia was really behind Europe in developing capitalism. So Russia's capitalist class prior to 1905 really didn't have much political power. And so the Russian bourgeoisie was trying to pose, as capitalists do, against the existing feudal order as freedom fighters for the whole population. The reality is once capitalists get into power, they hold that power just for themselves over and for the purpose of oppressing and exploiting the majority of the population. Because remember, there's no capitalism without an exploited working class whose surplus value is extracted to make the capitalists rich, to multiply capital. So you had at this time the capitalist, quote, freedom fighting force. The cadets were their major political party. And then there were also working class and peasant revolutionary parties. Everyone hated Tsarism, and each class had sort of its own approach to trying to liberate itself and get more freedom. So 1905 to 1907 was a period where major reforms were won. There was a parliament set up. Mainly, it was the capitalist class that was the happiest about that. The socialists did participate in it at times, but partly in protest and partly just to demonstrate that this parliament would be really limited in terms of what it would actually be able to do for the proletariat and peasantry. But anyway, you had this multi-year period where there was sort of an increase of rights and there were lots of strikes and demonstrations, as there were leading up to that point as well. And then there was a period of reaction and counter-revolution where the empire struck back, if you will. Eventually, after a few years of that, the anti-capitalist and anti-Tsarist forces did mount another offensive. And then World War II broke out in 1914, and then eventually there was the 1917 revolutions. First in February, the Tsar was completely overthrown. Then a provisional government led by the capitalist political parties was set up. And then later that year, October, there was a socialist revolution when the bourgeois capitalist-led provisional government was overthrown. Then there were 5 years of war, and then the founding of the USSR. So in 1913, we find ourselves at the beginning of the upsurge that would lead into the resistance to World War I. Let's pick up with Lenin's commentary now that that historical background has been clarified. A year has passed since the Lenin events and the first decisive upsurgence in the revolutionary working class movement since the June 3rd coup. Comment: the Lenin events. This was when a large group of striking workers were massacred. It was a very bad piece of PR for the government and a rallying point for progressive forces. Continuing. The Tsar's Black Hundreds and the landowners, the mob of officials and the bourgeoisie have celebrated the 300th anniversary of plunder, Tatar incursions, and the disgracing of Russia by the Romanovs. Comment: the Black Hundreds were reactionary forces, pro-monarchist, anti-minority. Fascism per se hadn't been invented yet at this time, but these were similarly reactionary, organized militia-type forces. The Fourth Duma, the Duma was the parliament, has convened and begun its, quote, work, though it has no faith in that work and has quite lost its former counter-revolutionary vigor. Confusion and tedium have beset liberal society, which is listlessly making appeals for reforms while admitting the impracticability of anything even approximating reform. So comment: Lenin here is setting the scene. We have some major strikes starting again, some invigoration of the progressive forces, while the capitalist and Tsarist forces are losing momentum. And now comes a May Day action by Russia's working class, who first held a rehearsal in Riga, then went into resolute action in St. Petersburg on May 1st. This action has rent the dun and dreary atmosphere like a thunderbolt. The tasks of the approaching revolution have come to the fore again in all their grandeur, and the forces of the advanced class leading it stand out in bold relief before hundreds of old revolutionaries, whom persecution by hangmen and desertion by friends have not defeated or broken, and before millions of people of the new generation of Democrats and Socialists. Weeks before May Day, the government appeared to have lost its wits, while the gentlemen who own factories behaved as if they had never had any wits at all. The arrests and searches seemed to have turned all the workers' districts in the capital upside down. The provinces didn't lag behind the center. The harassed factory owners called conferences and adopted contradictory slogans, now threatening the workers with punishment and lockouts, now making concessions in advance and consenting to stop work, now inciting the government to commit atrocities, now reproaching the government and calling on it to include May Day in the number of official holidays. But even though the gendarmes, domestic soldiers, showed the utmost zeal, even though they purged the industrial suburbs, even though they made arrests right and left according to their latest lists of suspects, it was no use. The workers laughed at the impotent rage of the Tsar's gang and the capitalist class, and derided the governor's menacing and pitiful announcements. They wrote satirical verses and circulated them by hand, or passed them on by word of mouth. They produced, as if from nowhere, fresh batches of small, poorly printed leaflets, short and plain, but very instructive, calling for strikes and demonstrations, and reminding the people of the old, uncurtailed, revolutionary slogans of the Social Democrats, Marxists at that time, who in 1905 led the first onslaught of the masses against the autocracy and against monarchy. 100,000 on strike on May Day, said the government press the next day. Bourgeois newspapers, using the first telegraphed information, reported 125,000. A correspondent of the central organ of the German Marxists wired from St. Petersburg that it was 150,000. And the day after, the whole bourgeois press quoted a figure of 200,000 to 220,000. Actually, the number of strikers reached 250,000. But apart from the number of May Day strikers, much more impressive and much more significant were the revolutionary street demonstrations held by the workers. Everywhere in and around the capital, crowds of workers singing revolutionary songs, calling loudly for revolution and carrying red flags, fought for several hours against police and security forces, frantically mobilized by the government. And those workers made the keenest of the Tsar's henchmen feel that the struggle was in earnest, that the police were not faced with a handful of individuals engaged in a trivial Slavophile affair, that it was actually the masses of the capital's working class who had risen. Footnote, Slavophile refers to the Slavophile demonstrations organized by reactionary nationalist elements in St. Petersburg on March 17, 18, and 24, on the occasion of the Serbo-Bulgarian victories over the Turks during the First Balkan War. The reactionaries tried to use the national liberation struggle of the Balkan peoples in the interests of the expansionist, great power politics of Russian Tsarism in the Near East. Back to the text. This was a really brilliant, open demonstration of the proletariat's revolutionary aspirations, of its revolutionary forces steeled and reinforced by new generations, of revolutionary appeals to the people and the peoples of Russia. Last year, the government and the manufacturers were able to take comfort from the fact that the Lenin explosion could not have been foreseen, that they could not have made immediate preparations to combat its consequences. This time, however, the monarchy had displayed acute foresight. There had been ample time for preparation, and the measures taken were most vigorous. The result was that the Tsarist monarchy revealed its complete impotence when faced with a revolutionary awakening of the proletarian masses. Indeed, 1 year of strike struggle since Lenin has shown, despite the pitiful outcries of the liberals and their yes-men against the, quote, craze for striking, against, quote, syndicalist strikes, against combining economic with political strikes and vice versa, this year has shown what a great and irreplaceable weapon for agitation among the masses, for rousing them, for drawing them into the struggle the social democratic or Marxist proletariat had forged for itself in the revolutionary epoch. The revolutionary mass-scale strike allowed the enemy neither rest nor respite. It also hit the enemy's purse, and in full view of the whole world, it trampled into the mud the political prestige of the allegedly strong Tsarist government. It enabled more and more sections of the workers to regain at least a small part of what had been achieved in 1905. and drew fresh sections of the working people, even the most backward of them, into the struggle. It did not exhaust the capacity of the workers. It was frequently demonstrative action of short duration, and at the same time it paved the way for further, still more impressive and more revolutionary open action by the masses in the shape of street demonstrations. During the last year, no country in the world has seen so many people on strike for political ends as Russia, or such perseverance, such variety, such vigor in strikes. This circumstance alone shows to the full the pettiness, the contemptible stupidity of those liberal and liquidationist sages who tried to, quote, adjust the tactics of the Russian workers in 1912-1913, using the yardstick of European constitutional periods that were mainly devoted to the preparatory work of bringing socialist education and enlightenment to the masses. The colossal superiority of the Russian strikes over those in the European countries, the most advanced countries, demonstrates not the special qualities or special abilities of Russia's workers, but the special conditions in present-day Russia, the existence of a revolutionary situation, the growth of a directly revolutionary crisis. When the moment of a similar growth of revolution approaches in Europe, there it will be a socialist and not a bourgeois democratic revolution as in our country. So comment there, what does that mean? A socialist revolution is one in which the organized workers take control over the capitalists. A bourgeois democratic revolution is when the capitalists take control over the feudal powers. And as I mentioned before, Russia had both of these things in 1917. It had its bourgeois democratic revolution, or rather completed it, I guess you could say, in February 1917 by deposing the Tsar, thereby building on the work since 1905 of setting up parliament, then getting more rights for the parliament, and then eventually getting rid of the Tsar entirely to pave the way for capitalism. However, heeding Marx and Engels' advice from as early as 1850 or so, the socialists in Russia were able, although capitalism was not fully developed in 1917, to set up workers' councils, Soviets, a parallel worker-led government-type organized system that was able to challenge the fledgling capitalist government, the provisional government, during the spring, summer, and fall of 1917, and then actually out-organize it and overthrow that, thus having a socialist revolution literally just like 9 months later. Remember, Lenin did not think that he was going to see revolution in his lifetime. However, due to the peculiar circumstances of World War I and a bunch of other things aligning, the Bolsheviks were able to organize and fight all the way to the end. Now, again, capitalism wasn't completely developed, so they did do the NEP and other early policies in the revolutionary history. However, collectivization did resume pretty shortly after that. Anyway, continuing. The proletariat of the most developed capitalist countries will launch far more vigorous revolutionary strikes, demonstrations, and armed struggle against the defenders of wage slavery. This year's May Day strike, like the series of strikes in Russia during the last 18 months, was revolutionary in character as distinguished not only from the usual economic strikes, but from demonstration strikes and from political strikes demanding constitutional reforms, like, for instance, the last Belgian strike. Footnote there, the strike referred to here took place in Belgium from April 14 to April 24, 1913. It was a general strike of the Belgian proletariat demanding a constitutional reform, the introduction of universal suffrage, or universal voting. Of the more than 1 million Belgian workers, between 400,000 and 500,000 took part in the strike. The development of the strike was regularly reported in Pravda, and lists of Russian workers' contributions in aid of the strike were also printed. Back to the text. Those who are in bondage to a liberal world outlook and no longer able to consider things from a revolutionary standpoint cannot possibly understand this distinctive character of the Russian strikes, a character that is due entirely to the revolutionary state of Russia. The epic of counter-revolution and of free play for renegade sentiment, which is to say reformist, sock-dem type stuff, has left behind it too many people of this kind, even among those who would like to be called social democrats, or again at that time, that was the term for Marxists. Russia is experiencing a revolutionary situation because the oppression of the vast majority of the population, not only of the proletariat, but of 9/10 of the small producers, particularly the peasants, has intensified to the maximum, and this intensified oppression, starvation, poverty, lack of rights, humiliation of the people, is furthermore glaringly inconsistent with the state of Russia's productive forces, inconsistent with the level of the class consciousness and the demands of the masses roused by the year 1905, and inconsistent with the state of affairs in all neighboring, not only European, but Asian countries. But that's not all. Oppression alone, no matter how great, doesn't always give rise to a revolutionary situation in a country. In most cases, it is not enough for revolution that the lower classes don't want to live in the old way. It's also necessary that the upper classes should be unable to rule and govern in the old way. That's what we see in Russia today. A political crisis is maturing before our very eyes. The bourgeoisie has done everything in its power to back counter-revolution and ensure, quote, peaceful development on this counter-revolutionary basis. The bourgeoisie gave hangmen and feudal lords as much money as they wanted. The bourgeoisie reviled the revolution and renounced it. The bourgeoisie licked the boots of Purishkevich, an arch-reactionary, and the knout of Markov II, and became their lackey. The bourgeoisie evolved theories based on European arguments, theories that revile the revolution of 1905 as an intellectualist revolution, and describe it as wicked, criminal, treasonous, and so on and so forth. And yet, despite all this sacrificing of its purse, its honor, and its conscience, the bourgeoisie, from the cadets to the Octoberists, itself admits that the autocracy and landowners were unable to ensure, quote, peaceful development, were unable to provide the basic conditions for law and order, without which a capitalist country cannot, in the 20th century, live side by side with Germany and the new China. A nationwide political crisis is in evidence in Russia, a crisis which affects the very foundation of the state system, and not just parts of it, which affects the foundation of the edifice, and not an outbuilding, not merely just one of its stories. No matter how many glib phrases our liberals and liquidators trot out to the effect that we have, thank God, a constitution, and that political reforms are on the order of the day, only very limited people don't see the close connection between these two propositions. No matter how much of this reformist verbiage is poured out, the fact remains that not a single liquidator or liberal can point to any reformist way out of this situation. Another comment here, a liquidator, Lenin's mentioned this a few times. Within the Marxist, or at that time they called it social democratic movement, there were pretty much two major factions. The Bolsheviks, what we would call communists today, which in my view actually uphold real Marxism, and then another faction of more watered down revisionist stuff, which took three basic forms over like a 20-year struggle between the late 1890s and 1917. First, they were the economists, people who believed that the upcoming revolution should be left to the bourgeoisie in terms of seizing political power, and that the proletariat should basically just be left to its own devices to do spontaneous revolts and organize for better conditions on the shop floor, but not revolutionary political power. They then became the Mensheviks, and then they became the liquidators. Basically, three different faces over time of some of the same attempts to water down Marxism, turn it into a reformist movement, hand more power over to the capitalists, and so on. So, liquidators. Continuing. The condition of the mass of the population in Russia, the aggravation of their position owing to the new agrarian policy, which the feudal landowners had to snatch at as their last means of salvation, the international situation, and the nature of the general political crisis that has taken shape in our country, such as the sum total of the objective conditions making Russia's situation a revolutionary one, because of the impossibility of carrying out the tasks of a bourgeois revolution by following the present course, and by the means available to the government and the exploiting classes. Such is the social, economic, and political situation, such as the class relationship in Russia that has given rise to a specific type of strike impossible in modern Europe, from which all sorts of renegades would like to borrow the example, not of yesterday's bourgeois revolutions, through which shine gleams of tomorrow's proletarian revolution, but of today's constitutional situation. Neither the oppression of the lower classes nor a crisis among the upper classes can cause a revolution. They can only cause the decay of a country, unless that country has a revolutionary class capable of transforming the passive state of oppression into an active state of revolt and insurrection. Wow, that's important. I'm going to read that again. Lenin mentioned earlier that the oppression of the lower classes, that on its own is not enough. It also needs a crisis among the upper classes, that they cannot continue to rule in the same way, that the system needs to be changed. But let's sum that up. Neither the oppression of the lower classes nor a crisis among the upper classes can cause a revolution. They can only cause the decay of a country, unless that country has a revolutionary class capable of transforming the passive state of oppression into an active state of revolt and insurrection. So in the United States today, do we have a sense of injustice and oppression? Yes, that is very widespread. Do we have a sense of solidarity, that the people have each other's backs? Not anywhere near the level that we would need. We need a lot of work on that. And then finally, do people feel that things can change? We got to work on that as well. We got to encourage revolutionary optimism and hope in people. Because why? To get out of the situation of just decay, where the lower classes are being oppressed, the upper classes are having a crisis, clearly that is the case. Well, the missing ingredient is a revolutionary class, which in capitalism is the proletariat, capable of transforming the passive state of oppression. In other words, going from a state of taking the kicks to the head, turning that into an active state of revolt and insurrection, standing up and refusing to take it anymore, turning that fight around. That is what needs to happen. And that is backed by a sense of injustice, a reason to act. 2, solidarity, feeling that if you step up, other people will have your back. And 3, a sense that another world is possible. In other words, we can get rid of the system and do a new system. When those things are in place, then the revolutionary class becomes capable of transforming their passive state of oppression into an active state of fighting back, revolt and insurrection, continuing. The role of a truly advanced class, a class really able to rouse the masses to revolution, really capable of saving Russia from decay, is played by the industrial proletariat. This is the task it fulfills by means of its revolutionary strikes. These strikes, which the liberals hate and the liquidators can't understand, are, as the February resolution of the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, puts it, quote, one of the most effective means of overcoming the apathy, despair, and disunion of the agricultural proletariat and the peasantry, and drawing them into the most concerted, simultaneous, and extensive revolutionary actions. The working class draws into revolutionary action the masses of the working and exploited people who are deprived of basic rights and driven to despair. The working class teaches them revolutionary struggle, trains them for revolutionary action, and explains to them where to find the way out and how to attain salvation. The working class teaches them not merely by words, but by deeds, by example. And the example is provided not by the adventures of solitary heroes, but by mass revolutionary action combining political and economic demands. How plain, how clear, how close these thoughts are to every honest worker who grasps even the rudiments of the theory of socialism and democracy, and how alien they are to those traitors of socialism and betrayers of democracy from among the intelligentsia, who revile or deride the underground and liquidationist newspapers, assuring naive simpletons that they are also social democrats. The May Day action of the proletariat of St. Petersburg, supported by that of the proletariat of all Russia, clearly showed once again to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear the great historic importance of the revolutionary underground in present-day Russia. The only RSDLP party organization in St. Petersburg, the St. Petersburg Committee, compelled even the bourgeois press before the May Day action, as well as on the eve of January 9 and on the eve of the tercentenary of the Romanovs, as well as on April 4, to note that St. Petersburg Committee leaflets had appeared again and again in the factories. Footnote there, April 4, that reference, 1913, was the first anniversary of the shooting of workers in the Lenin goldfields. It was marked by a one-day strike of St. Petersburg workers in which over 85,000 people participated. Continuing. Those leaflets cost colossal sacrifices. Sometimes they're quite unattractive in appearance. Some of them, the appeals for demonstration on April 4, for instance, merely announced the hour and place of the demonstration, in 6 lines, evidently said in secret and with extreme haste, in different printing shops and in different types. We have people, quote, also social democrats, who, when alluding to these conditions of underground work, snicker maliciously or curl a contemptuous lip and ask, if the entire party were limited to the underground, how many members would it have? 200 or 300? This is quoting from number 95 of Luch, a renegade newspaper, in its editorial defense of Mr. Sadov, who has the sad courage to be an outspoken liquidator. This issue of Luch appeared 5 days before the May Day action, i.e. at the very time the underground was preparing the leaflets. Messrs. Don, Patrusov and Company, who make these disgraceful statements, must know that there were thousands of proletarians in the party ranks as early as 1903, and 150,000 in 1907, that even now thousands and tens of thousands of workers print and circulate underground leaflets as members of underground RSDOP cells. But the liquidationist gentlemen know that they are protected by Stolypin, quote, legality, from a legal refutation of their foul lies and their grimaces, which are fouler still at the expense of the underground. See to what extent these despicable people have lost touch with the mass working class movement and with revolutionary work in general. Use even their own yardstick, deliberately falsified to suit the liberals. You may assume for a moment that 200 or 300 workers in St. Petersburg took part in printing and distributing those underground leaflets. What's the result? 200 or 300 workers, the flower of the St. Petersburg proletariat, people who not only call themselves social democrats but work as social democrats, people who are esteemed and appreciated for it by the entire working class of Russia, people who do not prate about a broad party, but make up in actual fact the only underground social democratic party existing in Russia. These people print and circulate underground leaflets. The Luch liquidators, protected by Stolypin censors, laugh contemptuously at the 200 or 300, the underground and its exaggerated importance, etc. And suddenly, a miracle occurs. In accordance with the decision drawn up by half a dozen members of the Executive Commission of the St. Petersburg Committee, a leaflet printed and circulated by 200 or 300, 250,000 people rise as one in St. Petersburg. The leaflets and the revolutionary speeches by workers at meetings and demonstrations do not speak of an open working class party, freedom of association, or reforms of that kind pushed by the liquidators, with the phantom of which the liberals are fooling the people. They speak of revolution as the only way out. They speak of the republic as the only slogan which, in contrast to liberal lies about reforms, indicates the change needed to ensure freedom, indicates the forces capable of rising consciously to defend it. The 2 million inhabitants of St. Petersburg see and hear these appeals for revolution, which go to the hearts of all toiling and oppressed sections of the people. All St. Petersburg sees from a real, mass-scale example what is the real way out and what is lying liberal talk about reforms. Thousands of workers' contacts and hundreds of bourgeois newspapers, which are compelled to report the St. Petersburg mass action, at least in snatches, spread throughout Russia the news of the stubborn strike campaign of the capital's proletariat. Both the mass of the peasantry and the peasants serving in the army hear this news of strikes, of the revolutionary demands of the workers, of their struggle for a republic and for the confiscation of the landed estates for the benefit of the peasants. Slowly but surely, the revolutionary strikes are stirring, rousing, enlightening, and organizing the masses of the people for revolution. The 200 or 300 underground people express the interests and needs of millions and tens of millions. They tell them the truth about their hopeless position, open their eyes to the necessity of revolutionary struggle, imbue them with faith in it, provide them with the correct slogans, and win these masses away from the influence of the high-sounding and thoroughly spurious reformist slogans of the bourgeoisie. And 2 or 3 dozen liquidators from among the intelligentsia, using money collected abroad and among liberal merchants to fool unenlightened workers, are carrying the slogans of that bourgeoisie into the workers' midst. The May Day strike, like all the revolutionary strikes of 1912 to 13, has made clear the 3 political camps into which present-day Russia is divided. The camp of hangmen and feudal lords, monarchy and the secret police. It has done its utmost in the way of atrocities and is already impotent against the masses of the workers. The camp of the bourgeoisie, all of them, from the cadets to the Octoberists, are shouting and moaning, calling for reforms and making fools of themselves by thinking that reforms are possible in Russia. The camp of the revolution, the only camp expressing the interests of the oppressed masses. All the ideological work, all the political work in this camp is carried out by underground social democrats or Marxists alone, by those who know how to use every legal opportunity in the spirit of social democracy and who are inseparably bound up with the advanced class, the proletariat. No one can tell beforehand whether this advanced class will succeed in leading the masses all the way to a victorious revolution. But this class is fulfilling its duty, leading the masses to that solution, despite all the vacillations and betrayals on the part of the liberals and those who are, quote, also social democrats, or again, Lenin is using this phrase mockingly, it is the liquidator's own phrase. Oh, we're Marxists too. Yeah, no, you're not. All the living and vital elements of Russian socialism and Russian democracy are being educated solely by the example of the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat and under its guidance. This year's May Day action has shown to the whole world that the Russian proletariat is steadfastly following its revolutionary course, apart from which there is no salvation for Russia that is suffocating and decaying alive. So that's the end of the audiobook. What do I have to add to this? I like this a lot. Lenin saw that the struggle was going into an upsurge and wanted to really fan those flames, point the way, point out the obstacles and enemies, and say, charge to the people who were moving forward. And that, I think, is my message. That's what we need to do as well. You know, going back to that key point about until the revolutionary class stops just lying down and taking the abuse, stands up, pushes back, fights back. Until that happens, you just decay, and that's the state that we're in now. So keep fighting. You know, we're seeing at least a slight upsurge of the labor movement in the United States today. We need to see a lot more. We need to see that grow from 1% increase in unionized people to 5% to 10%. And then we need to take those unions and make them more and more militant so that they're not just company unions. We need to keep expanding the radicalization of the working class because we, the working class, the dispossessed proletariat, whether you're employed or not, whether you're a student or not, whatever, if you do not have capital to live off of, but have to sell your labor or beg or any number of other things that people get reduced to in capitalism if they don't own profit-generating property. We are the only ones who can end this system and create something new, but not if we're lying down. So we gotta stand up, we gotta organize, we gotta build class consciousness, solidarity, network, unite for action against the capitalists who would trade our lives and futures for their short-term profits. That's not a system we need to hang on to. It is our duty to abolish it. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the September 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Capitalism and Workers' Immigration by Lenin from 1913. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Zapravdu number 22, October 29, 1913. Signed VI and published according to the Zapravdu text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1977, Moscow, Volume 19. Translated by the late George Hanna, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to Marxists.org for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's begin. Capitalism has given rise to a special form of migration of nations. The rapidly developing industrial countries, introducing machinery on a large scale and ousting the backward countries from the world market, raise wages at home above the average rate, and thus attract workers from the backward countries. Hundreds of thousands of workers thus wander hundreds and thousands of versts. A verst was a Russian unit of measure about equivalent to a kilometer. Advanced capitalism drags them forcibly into its orbit, tears them out of the backwoods in which they live, makes them participants in the world historical movement, and brings them face to face with the powerful, united, international class of factory owners. There can be no doubt that dire poverty alone compels people to abandon their native land, and that the capitalists exploit the immigrant workers in the most shameless manner. But only reactionaries can shut their eyes to the progressive significance of this modern migration of nations. Emancipation from the yoke of capital is impossible without the further development of capitalism, and without the class struggle that is based on it. And it is into this struggle that capitalism is drawing the masses of the working people of the whole world, breaking down the musty, fusty habits of local life, breaking down national barriers and prejudices, uniting workers from all countries in huge factories and mines in America, Germany, and so forth. The United States heads the list of countries which imports workers. The following are the immigration figures for the U.S. 10 years from 1821 to 30, 99,000. From 1831 to 40, 496,000. From 1841 to 50, 1.6 million. From 1851 to 60, 2.5 million. From 1861 to 70, 2 million. From 1871 to 80, 2.3 million. From 1881 to 90, 4.7 million. From 1891 to 1900, 3.7 million. From 1901 to 1909, 7.2 million. The growth of immigration is enormous, and it continues to increase. During the 5 years 1905 to 09, the average number of immigrants entering the United States was over 1 million a year. It is interesting to note the change in the place of origin of those emigrating to America. Up to 1880, the so-called old immigration prevailed. That is, immigration from the old civilized countries, such as Great Britain, Germany, and partly from Sweden. Even up to 1890, Great Britain and Germany provided more than half the total immigrants. From 1880 onwards, there was an incredibly rapid increase in what is called the new immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, from Austria, Italy, and Russia. The number of people emigrating from these three countries to the United States was as follows. From 1871 to 80, 201,000. From 1881 to 90, 927,000. From 1891 to 1900, 1.8 million. And from 1901 to 1909, 5.1 million. Thus, the most backward countries in the old world, those that more than any other retain survivals of feudalism in every branch of social life, are, as it were, undergoing compulsory training in civilization. American capitalism is tearing millions of workers out of backward Eastern Europe, including Russia, which in 1891 to 1900 provided 594,000 immigrants, and in 1900 to 09, 1.4 million, out of their semi-feudal conditions, and is putting them in the ranks of the advanced international army of the proletariat. Hourwich, the author of an extremely illuminating book, Immigration and Labor, which appeared in English last year, makes some interesting observations. The number of people emigrating to America grew particularly after the 1905 revolution. 1905, 1 million, 1906, 1.2 million, 1907, 1.4 million, 1908 and 09, 1.9 million. Workers who had participated in various strikes in Russia introduced into the US the bolder and more aggressive spirit of the mass strike. Russia is lagging farther and farther behind, losing some of her best workers to foreign countries. America is advancing more and more rapidly, taking the most vigorous and able-bodied sections of the working population of the whole world. Germany, which is more or less keeping pace with the US, is changing from a country which released workers into one that attracts them from foreign countries. The number of immigrants from Germany to America in the 10 years 1881 to 90 was 1.5 million. But in the 9 years 1901 to 09, it dropped to 310,000. The number of foreign workers in Germany, however, was 695,000 in 1910 to 11 and 729,000 in 1911 to 12. Dividing these immigrants according to occupation and country of origin, we get the following. From Russia, 274,000 in agriculture, in industry, 34,000. Total, 308,000 from Russia. From Austria, 101,000 in agriculture and 162,000 in industry. Total, 263,000. From other countries, 22,000 in agriculture, 135,000 in industry, total 157,000. Overall total, 397,000 in agriculture, 331,000 in industry, 728,000 total. The more backward the country, the larger is the number of, quote, unskilled agricultural laborers that it supplies. The advanced nations seize, as it were, the best paid occupations for themselves and leave these semi-barbarian countries the worst paid occupations. Europe in general, meaning other countries in that chart, provided Germany with 157,000 workers, of whom more than 8/10, 135,000 out of 157,000, were industrial workers. Backward Austria provided only 6/10, 162 out of 263,000 of the industrial workers. The most backward country of all, Russia, provided only 1/10 of the industrial workers, 34 out of 308,000. Thus, Russia is punished everywhere and in everything for her backwardness. But compared with the rest of the population, it's the workers of Russia who are more than any others bursting out of this state of backwardness and barbarism, more than any others combating these, quote, delightful features of their native land, and more closely than any others uniting with the workers of all countries into a single international force for emancipation. The bourgeoisie incites the workers of one nation against those of another in the endeavor to keep them disunited. Class-conscious workers, realizing that the breakdown of all the national barriers by capitalism is inevitable and progressive, are trying to help to enlighten and organize their fellow workers from the backward countries. That's the end of the audiobook. There's just a quick note. Other countries on the American continent besides the United States are also rapidly advancing. The number of immigrants entering the United States last year was about 250,000, Brazil about 170,000, and Canada over 200,000. Total 620,000 for the year. So now we're living in an age in 2022 of Fortress Europe, Fortress America. There's a lot of capitalist-funded, right-wing, quote, populist or just fascist movements arising. They will try to pretend to mainstream themselves as just merely conservatives, but it's more than that. This is an age of crisis for capitalism, highly advanced, consolidated capitalism, which is to say imperialism, which goes through a process of fascization and becomes fascist. One of the components of this that is revealing itself in the current character of this worldwide trend is anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, there are other things such as anti-abortion and general anti-feminist sentiment, anti-LGBTQ+, which is to say, conversely, pro-patriarchy, pro-quote traditional gender roles, even though we're talking about gender roles that were created by capitalism. They're not actually traditional or natural or anything like that. Matriarchy is actually the natural state of humanity prior to class society, which we communists are seeking to abolish. And so there is this backward, highly reactionary fascist trend, which is anti-left, anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-Marxist, whatever sort of synonym for that you want to use. Obviously, we Marxists know that there are differences between these things. However, look at the Republican Party in the United States, for example. To them, literally everything that they don't like is communist. Democrats are communist, whatever. So, that's something to keep in mind when sort of analyzing this. But they all are explicitly anti-left. Some of them actually do study Marxism in order to better combat it. Why? Because their purpose is to shore up capitalism. Now, as Lenin says, class-conscious workers, realizing that the breakdown of all the national barriers by capitalism is inevitable and progressive, are trying to help to enlighten and organize their fellow workers from the backward countries. So there's a book out there by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So capitalists have realized that this sort of progress that capitalism does bring ultimately threatens to undermine capitalism itself. Why? Because capitalism is born out of feudalism. It ascends. At first it's progressive, and as Lenin says, it breaks down national barriers. First it creates nations, but then after they've created the nation state to create a national market for the new capitalist class, well, eventually they saturate the home market. All of that is completely conquered, and then they have to turn outwards. And also increasing amounts of international trade occur, and the national borders become actually barriers to capitalism. So this is why Lenin said that there is a centralizing trend. Capital tends to consolidate into larger and larger enterprises over time, and these nation states which capitalism created to assist it on the way up, then capitalism has to strike this balance between not causing the conditions for its own downfall, but trying to tread water sort of at its peak. It's trying to sustain its glory days. The problem is it has to revert to fascism to try to do this because it's inherently unstable. Fascism is born, it ascends, it lives, it dies. And advanced capitalism is global, and the nation states, that system is in many ways incompatible with it. There is an internationalism which emerges, and as we see the cross-globe immigration and emigration of workers from this market to that market to sell their labor for wages and set up a life there and all that kind of stuff. This is increasingly a global society, and it's one created by capitalism. So fascism is basically the response to how do we keep all of the class exploitation which enriches the capitalists, because it's a movement of and for capitalists, without capitalism advancing any further, which puts it more and more danger of socialist revolution. And the answer that they come up with is basically intense repression of class-conscious workers' movements combined with destruction of the means of production. So they're trying to just hover indefinitely in this area to basically avoid death for this phase of class society, capitalism. And a certain kind of brash nationalism is part of that formula. Again, fascism is always global at the end of the day. So really this is another kind of hypocrisy where the capitalists create an order that they themselves don't really have to live in, don't really have to abide by its rules, etc. But again, it's part of this increasing cage that they try to put workers in to avoid the effects of the contradictions of the system that they're pushing ever more forcefully. So the antidote to this is proletarian revolution fueled by proletarian internationalism. That's our basis. Capitalism has gone as far as it can go. The future of capitalism is more fascism until the time that workers abolish it and move on into socialism. We can only do that on an internationalist basis, not by buying into anti-immigrant, nationalist, nativist sentiments as pushed by the would-be friends of the workers in the right-wing populist fascist coalitions. All right, that's the end of my comments. What do you think? Leave a question or comment in the comment section below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. We don't run ads on this channel, so that support is vital. If you'd like to kick in a few bucks, that would be great. It can be recurring, or you can just kick in a few bucks and call it a day. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, so much appreciated. Patreon.com/socialismforall. Also, engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe. All of that helps YouTube to recommend this content to more people. So even if you're not directly sharing it on your social media for other people to see, or if you don't have a large social media account, at least do that stuff. Leave a comment, even if it's thanks, good video, whatever, and you will be helping YouTube to reach out to other people and share this material. Finally, remember the struggle happens in the real world, so look around for orgs, parties, unions, whether it's labor union, community union, tenant unions, or again, political parties, something like that, in your area, even if you're just joining on a state or national level. It's time to get organized. The capitalists are, and increasingly the fascists are as well. So we have to get organized as well. It's not just about electing people. If you can run candidates, then that's fine, but it's about organizing, networking, increasing class consciousness, and creating a force that can be mobilized for workers' actions. Remember, if we don't build these parties, nobody will. Socialism is history that the workers write, so get to it. All right, thanks again, and we will see you in the next video. Hi, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is March 22nd, 2020. Before we get into today's audiobook, I just want to ask you take a minute to like, share, subscribe, comment. All of that helps boost this video in the algorithm, helps amplify the channel, and gets our message of socialism to more and more people. So that's much appreciated. So today's recording is an audiobook of Karl Marx, a brief biographical sketch with an exposition of Marxism by Vladimir Lenin. This is the second in the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide. You can find a playlist for the entire study guide on the Socialism for All channel. So this work was written in 1914. The source is Lenin's collected works, Moscow 1974. published by Progress Publishers, first published in 1915 in the Granite Encyclopedia 7th edition. However, that edition was censored for political reasons. It was a very popular encyclopedia at the time, and they took out the last two sections, Socialism and Tactics of the Class Struggle of the Proletariat. They made a number of other changes to the text. This is a restored edition that includes those sections. This was translated by Clemens Dutt, edited by Stuart Smith, and credit to Marxist Internet Archive for hosting this document. You can find a link to this document and all of the documents in the Marxism-Leninism Basic Study Guide in the video description, also at Facebook, facebook.com/socialismforall. So we're going to get into the audiobook now. This is a longer document, and I will preface this by saying there are a lot of philosophical and economic terms in this. You may find it dry. I think that this is one of the headier documents in this collection. You may need to listen to it a few times, but stick with it. At least let some of these terms permeate your consciousness and sink in through osmosis, at least even if you don't grasp everything the first time around. This document has several sections: a preface, a biographical sketch of Karl Marx, the Marxist doctrine, Marx's economic doctrine, socialism, and tactics of the class struggle of the proletariat. Lastly, I'm going to mention that there are a number of endnotes and side notes in this document. For ease of reading, I'm not going to be reading them into this audiobook. However, you can find them at the link. So let's get into the audiobook. Thanks for listening. Preface. This article on Karl Marx, which now appears in a separate printing, was written in 1913, as far as I can remember, for the Granite Encyclopedia. A fairly detailed bibliography of literature on Marx, mostly foreign, was appended to the article. This has been omitted in the present edition. The editor of the encyclopedia, for their part, have, for censorship reasons, deleted the end of the article on Marx, namely the section dealing with his revolutionary tactics. Unfortunately, I am unable to reproduce that end because the draft has remained among my papers somewhere in Krakow or in Switzerland. I only remember that in the concluding part of the article I quoted, among other things, the passage from Marx's letter to Engels of April 16th, 1856, in which he wrote, quote, "The whole thing in Germany will depend on the possibility of backing the proletarian revolution by some second edition of the Peasant War. Then the affair will be splendid," end quote. That is what our Mensheviks, who have now sunk to utter betrayal of socialism and to desertion to the bourgeoisie, have failed to understand since 1905. Lenin, Moscow, May 14, 1918. Section 1, Biography. Marx Karl was born. Karl Marx was born on May 5, 1818, in the city of Trier, Rhenish Prussia. His father was a lawyer, a Jew, who in 1824 adopted Protestantism. The family was well-to-do, cultured, but not revolutionary. After graduating from a gymnasium in Trier, Marx entered the university, first at Bonn and later in Berlin, where he read law, majoring in history and philosophy. He concluded his university course in 1841, submitting a doctoral thesis on the philosophy of Epicurus. At the time, Marx was a Hegelian idealist in his views. In Berlin, he belonged to the circle of left Hegelians, Bruno Bauer and others, who sought to draw atheistic and revolutionary conclusions from Hegel's philosophy. After graduating, Marx moved to Bonn, hoping to become a professor. However, the reactionary policy of the government, which deprived Ludwig Feuerbach of his chair in 1832, refused to allow him to return to the university in 1836, and in 1841 forbade young Professor Bruno Bauer to lecture at Bonn, made Marx abandon the idea of an academic career. Left Hegelian views were making rapid headway in Germany at the time. Feuerbach began to criticize theology, particularly after 1836, and turned to materialism, which in 1841 gained ascendancy in his philosophy, The Essence of Christianity. The year 1843 saw the appearance of his Principles of the Philosophy of the Future. Quote, "One must oneself have experienced the liberating effect," end quote, of these books, Engels subsequently wrote of these works of Feuerbach. Quote, we, meaning the left Hegelians, including Marx, all became at once Feuerbachians, end quote. At that time, some radical bourgeois in the Rhineland who were in touch with the left Hegelians founded, in Cologne, an opposition paper called Rheinische Zeitung. The first issue appeared on January 1st, 1842. Marx and Bruno Bauer were invited to be the chief contributors, and in October 1842, Marx became editor-in-chief and moved from Bonn to Cologne. The newspaper's revolutionary democratic trend became more and more pronounced under Marx's editorship, and the government first imposed double and triple censorship on the paper, and then on January 1st, 1843, decided to suppress it. Marx had to resign the editorship before that date, but his resignation did not save the paper, which suspended publication in March 1843. Of the major articles Marx contributed to Rheinische Zeitung, Engels notes, in addition to those indicated below, an article on the condition of peasant wine growers in the Moselle Valley. Marx's journalistic activities convinced him that he was insufficiently acquainted with political economy, and he zealously set out to study it. In 1843, Marx married, at Kreuznach, a childhood friend he had become engaged to while still a student. His wife came of a reactionary family of the Prussian nobility, her elder brother being Prussia's Minister of the Interior during a most reactionary period, 1850 to 1858. In the autumn of 1843, Marx went to Paris in order to publish a radical journal abroad, together with Arnold Ruge, left Hegelian, in prison in 1825 to 30, a political exile following 1848, and a Bismarckian after 1866 to 70. Only one issue of this journal, Deutsches Französische Jahrbucher, appeared. Publication was discontinued owing to the difficulty of secretly distributing it in Germany and to disagreement with Ruge. Marx's articles in this journal showed that he was already a revolutionary who advocated, quote, merciless criticism of everything existing, end quote, and in particular the, quote, criticism by weapon, end quote, and appealed to the masses and to the proletariat. In September 1844, Friedrich Engels came to Paris for a few days, and from that time on became Marx's closest friend. They both took a most active part in the then seething life of the revolutionary groups in Paris. Of particular importance at the time was Proudhon's doctrine, which Marx pulled to pieces in his Poverty of Philosophy, 1847. Waging a vigorous struggle against the various doctrines of petty bourgeois socialism, they worked out the theory and tactics of revolutionary proletarian socialism, or communism Marxism. See Marx's works of this period, 1844 to 48, in the bibliography. At the insistent request of the Prussian government, Marx was banished from Paris in 1845 as a dangerous revolutionary. He went to Brussels. In the spring of 1847, Marx and Engels joined a secret propaganda society called the Communist League. They took a prominent part in the League's Second Congress in London, November 1847, at whose request they drew up the celebrated Communist Manifesto, which appeared in February 1848. With the clarity and brilliance of genius, this work outlines a new world conception, consistent with materialism, which also embraces the realm of social life, dialectics, as the most comprehensive and profound doctrine of development, the theory of the class struggle, and of the world historic revolutionary role of the proletariat, the creator of a new communist society. On the outbreak of the Revolution of February 1848, Marx was banished from Belgium. He returned to Paris, whence, after the March Revolution, he went to Cologne, Germany, where Neue Rheinische Zeitung was published from June 1st, 1848 to May 19th, 1849, with Marx as editor-in-chief. The new theory was splendidly confirmed by the course of the revolutionary events of 1848 to 49, just as it has been subsequently confirmed by all proletarian and democratic movements in all countries of the world. The victorious counter-revolution first instigated court proceedings against Marx. He was acquitted on February 9th, 1849, and then banished him from Germany, May 16th, 1849. First, Marx went to Paris, was again banished after the demonstration of June 13th, 1849, and then went to London, where he lived until his death. His life as a political exile was a very hard one, as the correspondence between Marx and Engels, published in 1913, clearly reveals. Poverty weighed heavily on Marx and his family. Had it not been for Engels' constant and selfless financial aid, Marx would not only have been unable to complete Capital, but would inevitably have been crushed by want. Moreover, the prevailing doctrines and trends of petty bourgeois socialism and of non-proletarian socialism in general forced Marx to wage a continuous and merciless struggle, and sometimes to repel the most savage and monstrous personal attacks, Herrfurcht. Marx, who stood alone from circles of political exiles, developed his materialist theory in a number of historical works, devoting himself mainly to a study of political economy. Marx revolutionized science, see the Marxist doctrine below, in his Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859, and Capital, Volume 1, 1867. The revival of the democratic movements in the late 50s and in the 60s recalled Marx to practical activity. In 1864, September 28th, the International Working Men's Association, the celebrated First International, was founded in London. Marx was the heart and soul of this organization and author of its first address, and of a host of resolutions, declarations, and manifestos. In uniting the labor movement of various forms of non-proletarian pre-Marxist socialism, Mazzini, Proudhon, Bakunin, liberal trade unionism in Britain, Lassallean vacillations to the right in Germany, and in combating the theories of all these sects and schools, Marx hammered out a uniform tactic for the proletarian struggle of the working in the various countries. Following the downfall of the Paris Commune, 1871, of which gave such a profound, clear-cut, brilliant, effective, and revolutionary analysis, the Civil War in France, 1871, and the Bakunin-caused cleavage in the International, the latter organization could no longer exist in Europe. After the Hague Congress of the International, 1872, Marx had the General Council of the International had played its historical part, and now made way for a period of a far greater development of the labor movement in all countries in the world, a period in which the movement grew in scope and mass socialist working class parties and individual national states were formed. Marx's health was undermined by his strenuous work in the International and his still more strenuous theoretical occupations. He continued work on the refashioning of political economy and on the completion of Capital, for which he collected a mass of new material and studied a number of languages, Russian for instance. However, ill health prevented him from completing Capital. His wife died on December 2, 1881, and on March 14, 1883, Marx passed away peacefully in his armchair. He lies buried next to his wife at Highgate Cemetery in London. Of Marx's children, some died in childhood in London when the family were living in destitute circumstances. 3 daughters married English and French socialists, Eleanor Aveling, Laura Lafargue, and Jenny Longuet. The latter's son is a member of the French Socialist Party. Section 2. The Marxist Doctrine. Marxism is the system of Marx's views and teachings. Marx was the genius who continued and consummated the 3 main ideological currents of the 19th century, as represented by the 3 most advanced countries of humankind: classical German philosophy, classical English political economy, and French socialism combined with French revolutionary doctrines in general. Acknowledged even by his opponents, the remarkable consistency and integrity of Marx's views, whose totality constitutes modern materialism and modern scientific socialism, as the theory and program of the working class movement in all the civilized countries of the world, make it incumbent on us to present a brief outline of his world conception in general, prior to giving an exposition of the principal content of Marxism, namely, Marx's economic doctrine. Philosophical materialism. Beginning with the years 1844 to 45, when his views took shape, Marx was a materialist, and especially a follower of Ludwig Feuerbach, whose weak point he subsequently saw only in his materialism being insufficiently consistent and comprehensive. To Marx, Feuerbach's historic and epoch-making significance lay in his having resolutely broken with Hegel's idealism, and in his proclamation of materialism, which already, quote, in the 18th century, particularly French materialism, was not only a struggle against the existing political institutions and against religion and theology, but also against all metaphysics, end quote, in the sense of, quote, drunken speculation, end quote, as distinct from, quote, sober philosophy, end quote. the Holy Family in Literature Nachlass. To Hegel, wrote Marx, the process of thinking which under the name of the idea he even transforms into an independent subject is to the demiurgos, the creator or the maker of the real world. With me, on the contrary, this ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought. Capital, Volume 1, afterward to the second edition. In full conformity with this materialist philosophy of Marx's, and expounding it, Friedrich Engels wrote in Anti-Durang, read by Marx in the manuscript, quote, "The real unity of the world consists in its materiality, and this is proved by a long and wearisome development of philosophy and natural science. Motion is the mode of existence of matter. Never anywhere has there been matter without motion, or motion without matter, nor can there be. But if the question is raised, what thought and consciousness really are, and where they come from, it becomes apparent that they are products of the human brain, and that man himself is a product of nature, which has developed in and along with its environment. Hence it is self-evident that the products of the human brain, being in the last analysis also products of nature, do not contradict the rest of nature's interconnections, but are in correspondence with them." Hegel was an idealist. That is to say, the thoughts within his mind were to him not the more or less abstract images or reflections. Engels sometimes speaks of imprints, as this word, of real things and processes, but on the contrary, things in their development were to him only the images made real of the, quote, idea existing somewhere or other before the world existed. In his Ludwig Feuerbach, which expounded his own and Marx's views on Feuerbach's philosophy, and was sent to the printers after he had reread an old manuscript Marx and himself had written in 1844-45 on Hegel, Feuerbach, and the materialist conception of history, Engels wrote, quote, "The great basic question to all of philosophy, especially of more recent philosophy, is the relation of thinking and being, spirit to nature. Which is primary, spirit or nature? The answers which the philosophers gave to this question split them into two great camps. Those who asserted the primary of spirit to nature, and therefore, in the last instance, assumed world creation in some form or another, comprised the camp of idealism. The others, who regarded nature as primary, belonged to the various schools of materialism." End quote. Any other use of the concepts of philosophical idealism and materialism leads only to confusion. Marx decidedly rejected not only idealism, which is always linked in one way or another with religion, but also the views, especially widespread in our day, of Hume and Kant, agnosticism, criticism, and positivism in their various forms. He considered that philosophy a reactionary concession to idealism, and at best a, quote, shamefaced way of surreptitiously accepting materialism while denying it before the world, end quote. On this question, see, besides the works by Marx and Engels mentioned above, a letter Marx wrote to Engels on December 12, 1868, in which, referring to an utterance by the naturalist Thomas Huxley, which was, quote, more materialistic, end quote, than usual, and to his recognition that, quote, as long as we actually observe and think, we cannot possibly get away from materialism, end quote, Marx reproached Huxley for leaving a, quote, loophole, end quote, for agnosticism, for Humism. It is particularly important to note Marx's view on the relation between freedom and necessity. Quote, freedom is the appreciation of necessity. Necessity is blind only insofar as it is not understood. Engels and Anti-Durang. This means recognition of the rule of objective laws in nature, and of the dialectical transformation of necessity into freedom, in the same manner as the transformation of the uncognized but cognizable thing in itself into the thing for us, of the essence of things into phenomena. Marx and Engels considered that the old materialism, including that of Feuerbach, and still more the vulgar materialism of Buchner, Vogt, and Molschat, contained the following major shortcomings. 1. This materialism was predominant.
We will come back to that tomorrow at the same time. Please like, share, and subscribe. This has been my daily routine of meditation, yoga, and martial arts. This is Pikachu and Bulbasaur the cats. And we do a little reading of communist theory, ideology, and then we meditate and sit and listen to some Lenin, because just sitting and doing nothing is useless, but it is also more useless to meditate on imaginary things that don't improve the material world in reality. And then we practice some yoga and then some martial arts. So please practice along with me, join in, and become strong in body and mind so that you can actually change the world for the better instead of just thinking or talking about it.